Welcome to the StarPodLog comic scene with your hosts, Jeff and Tony.
Hi, I'm Jeff Wiley.
I'm Tony Barletta.
All right, we are recording this on a Monday, and if we were recording this on a Monday in the next couple of weeks, then the following day would be New Comic Book Tuesday, which is really weird when you say it out loud, but the reason for that is last week, DC severed a 25-year relationship with Diamond, who distributes comic books, certainly nationwide, I believe globally, pretty much exclusively. DC has decided to go in their own direction. Tony, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the last one of these we recorded, we were talking about the effects of COVID-19 on the comics industry. We had mentioned that DC was the first company with new comics back. While Diamond was shut down, they decided to create new distribution lanes. Instead of Diamond, they went to Midtown Comics on the East Coast and DCBS, which is another subscription service on the left coast there. And it was very mixed. Some shops decided to go that route. Others were loyal to Diamond. And it seems that the ones that went ahead with it and decided to create accounts with those two companies while the Diamond was shut down are definitely going to be ahead of the curve because they have an account now with the new system, whereas the others, DC didn't give them much time. So they have to try to create an account for a whole new distribution lane for all DC titles. And they only have about a week and a half to do that. It's not a whole lot of time.
No.
So those people that were loyal to Diamond are I'm sure wishing that maybe they hadn't been. They didn't see this coming.
You know, to that point, I think a lot of retailers did see this coming, but a lot of the chatter I read online, many of them did not, and they are in turn quite furious about this. Mile High Comics in Denver, the shop owner posted a rant the other day, and he actually said that he wanted to clear DC Comics from his store. He launched a sale where you could get 50% off using the code DC sucks. Like that's how angry he was. I've not seen a lot of retailers that are happy about this. But that being said, I kind of feel like this might have been a strategic move on DC's part because with COVID-19 being what it is and the industry being shut down, and they also have a couple of huge events on the horizon. They have Joker War coming up, and they have Death Metal, which is a sequel to their previously very successful Metal storyline. And
not to mention the Punchline, Joker's new girlfriend, is going to debut in a most likely highly sought after issue of Batman that's going to be coming out, I believe, probably right around the time when the change takes place. So if people are not able to get their, orders set up with the new system in time, they might not be able to order comics for that week for DC, and that might be really, really tough for that store.
I wonder too, like there's been a lot of ripple effects from this already. Marvel just announced today, and I just learned this about an hour ago. Don't have many details in front of me, but they just announced about an hour ago, or I learned about an hour ago, that they are going to go forward with their own free comic book day in a couple of months, independent of the traditionally industry-wide held event, which has been postponed this year because of COVID-19. And I'm wondering if they're doing that as a response, because as a response to what DC has done, because DC has these two big events in the pipeline, and Marvel's wasn't slated until September, X of Swords. But now their free comic book day offering, which I believe is a lead in to that storyline. I wonder if they're trying to cut DC off at the knees. There hasn't been a lot of competition, I feel, at the newsstand between DC and Marvel in recent years, but it seems like in the last couple of weeks, it's really gotten ramped up.
I don't know if I'd use the word competition, but it seems like a different mindset. It seems, like you'd said, it seems Marvel's intention is goodwill with the whole industry, with the fans, give some free content out there to people, ease people back into buying new comics. I think if you look at what's been coming out the last couple of weeks from Marvel, since Diamond's been back, there's very few Marvel titles, just a couple every week. Certainly much, much less than they're used to on a full week, whereas DC, they're almost right back to the full week that they were accustomed to. And not only that, I mean, this past week they had two $10 books. This next week they got a $10 book. I mean, they're not really slow in putting out product as Marvel is. It seems Marvel's all about the goodwill with the fans and the retailers, and DC's pumping out as much product as they can.
And to your point too, I don't see, as furious as the retailers might be right now, I don't see them completely punting on DC books. I mean, you can't convince me that a mom and pop LCS is going to not carry Batman comics, one of the most consistently selling books of at least the last 30 years.
Well,
they're not going to say no to that.
You're going to have fans that are only into indie books, of course. You're going to have fans that are only Marvel books. I would say there's still a big chunk of fans that are DC fans that like DC and that like indie and like Marvel at the same time. If they're not able to get DC there, they're going to have to find another place to get their DC. If they go to another place for their DC, are they going to continue to shop at two different places, or are they just going to only go to the place that carries the DC with the rest? That seems to be a tough route to go if you can't sell any DC.
Yeah, exactly. I hope that this is just a growing pains for the industry, and that maybe things will even out, and maybe Diamond will be forced to step up their game, because the manager at my LCS has repeatedly, almost weekly, mentioned how poor their shipping practices are, that he always gets shorted books or the books arrive damaged. And
I think most people, yeah.
The people that DC have chosen, apparently the shipping practices are miles ahead. Like, they use bubble wrap, and so I don't know if they're going to be able to maintain, like right now, things aren't at a normal pace. Like right now, the books that DC or Marvel or any other publisher pumps out are less than what we are normally used to. So is that something that they're going to be able to maintain when things really get cranking again?
Yeah, I mean, like you'd mentioned, they do ship books with a lot more protection than Diamond, because, Midtown Comics is a pretty big online retailer, and when they have volume shipping like they do, customers want their stuff padded, they want it protected, and if it's not, they get angry customers that won't order again or will ask for a refund. So they've learned from that. So because they're in that position, they're inclined to ship things in better protection. And yeah, I can always remember that hearing stories all the time. What happened to a specific title? Well, Diamond shorted us. Why'd they short you? We have no idea. They just decided not to send us as many books as they should have. And then you got to wonder, are they going to show up? Or are they not going to show up? And oftentimes they have no idea if they're going to show up. And they've been operating that way for a very long time now, only because they're the only way you can get the books, because they were the only game in town. So maybe they'll be forced to, provide better, service to their customers in the retail market now. I can understand certainly retailers frustrated with having to go through what they deem as another competitor, such as Midtown Comics. But I also look at DC. I mean, if they decided that they wanted to hurry up and create a new distributor immediately, there's really no one else they could have used. They couldn't just create a brand new company out of thin air that had no knowledge of the industry, that had no knowledge of mailing their product, where Midtown has all that knowledge,
right,
in abundance, and so does DCBS. So I don't see the DC, if they wanted to create another distributor, had much choice but to go that route. I mean, unless they were willing to take years for it to materialize, and they weren't. So, I think it all traces itself back too when they got rid of Dan DiDio last year. It's a new company. The whole company, top to bottom, is it's a new mandate at that place, and they're not playing games. They're making decisions for the better or worse of the comic book industry, and we just have to wait and see what that's going to be.
I saw a theory over the weekend that someone that is a retailer, and I won't mention their name, but he said that he believes that we will learn in the future that the reason Dan DiDio was fired is because he tried to prevent this from happening. Which I thought that was an interesting theory.
Wow.
I'm not saying I subscribe to it. I'm saying I think it's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
But I wonder, do you think, comic fans, we are a passionate bunch. We are very passionate about our hobby. But that being said, do you think that this is, I don't know how big of a deal this is to most comic book fans. And to borrow what I heard someone else say about this, they said, if I go to Dunkin' Donuts, I don't care where the beans come from. I just want to get a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I don't think the fans really cares. I don't think the fan has much enthusiasm one way or another. I think to a fan, it's just a story they read and push it to the side. The retailer's the one that cares, and depending on whether or not they have an account set up with the new company, can they get an account with the new company? Are they making it easy for them? Are they not? Are the shipping costs higher? There's a lot of things for them to consider. So I think the people that are mostly panicking are the retailers, because there's a lot of unknowns right now with something brand new like this. And the fan, the fan will show up if the product's there. And even something my local comic book shop told me too is, we're just coming out of the pandemic. We're opening things back up again. Sales are not what they used to be. Sales are going up slowly, and they got to get used to trying to get fans back out, trying to get profits back up, because we've been through a lot as a country, and people aren't spending the money as readily as they used to. So everything's changing, and it's all that's going to be a lot for a comic book store to juggle right now, and it's something they have to adapt to and do it very quickly, and where we come out from that in the near future, we'll see. And right now it's a lot of uncertainty for comic shops, but hopefully everybody adapts quickly.
It is. You're absolutely right. And your statement about a lot going on is a perfect segue to our next topic, and that is what's been happening in the world in the last couple of weeks, and specifically what's been going on in America with the civil unrest and the response to the death of George Floyd. I think that there has been a very eye-opening moment in American history that we are living through right now. And from a comic book angle, comics, by and large, have always tried, well, I say always, they have attempted to lead the way in diversity over the years. During the Civil Rights Movement, the X-Men were born as a reflection of the Civil Rights Movement. But
very true.
There are all kinds of examples that you can cite where both DC and Marvel, the longest running publishers, have attempted to integrate people of color, characters of color, into their titles.
And I think that's something both companies, DC and Marvel, have had a great history of, especially looking back at the 70s. The 70s were, just a decade removed from civil rights era. And so that's an interesting time to look at what was coming out in comics back then. And one of the most famous comics of the day in the 70s was Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where both heroes teamed up under the writing and drawing team of Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, and they tackled social issues of the day head on. And one of the most remembered panels of that whole run is the famous one where there's an older black man standing there looking at Green Lantern saying, you've saved the green people, you saved the purple people, what have you ever done for the brown people? And he's hanging his head and says nothing. And, to this day, it's one of the most powerful panels in comics history. And that was from the 70s. And that made a big impression on many people.
That is true. That is true. And one thing when I was doing my research for this topic is I found it interesting that both Marvel and DC have certainly introduced their fair share of people of color, both as superheroes and as supporting characters in those heroes' world. But one thing I thought was really interesting was I really had a hard time finding a defining storyline on race relations. You can find storylines on drug abuse. You can find storylines on the LGBT community. Marvel produced a special comic, Amazing Spider-Man, I believe 36, to discuss 9/11. But just a story about race relations, but from Marvel or DC, is hard to come by.
Well, I mean, you do look at something like back in the 70s again. We had these characters from the 60s from the civil rights era that were created, like Black Panther, and he's more popular than ever, which is an amazing thing to see. And one of the writers who contributed more than any other writer to that character, Don McGregor, wrote amazing stories from the 70s, and he really resonated with that character. And he wrote a storyline in the 70s, Black Panther versus the KKK. And he said on Facebook how difficult it was getting that out there back in the day. But I have a copy I've tracked down last year. It's an amazing thing to see. It's a beautiful piece of comic book history that it was able to get out there and be printed. But yeah, you're right. It is few and far between.
I wonder if, based on the other topics that I mentioned, is race relations, is it just too hot button for the major publishers to tackle? But now, in comics have almost always reflected society, and
sure.
I'm really hoping that Marvel or DC or any of the other publishers will take a stab at reflecting what's happening in the world right now. I mean, there are interracial relationships, like you and I were talking about Saga before we began recording. The main two characters are an interracial couple.
Right.
There are other interracial couples in comics. There have been let me think. There was most recently Ironheart in Marvel.
And I believe she could have her own TV show too.
I believe you're right. I seem to recall reading that somewhere. But there's plenty of long-term representations of racial diversity, and I hope we get more.
Extrapolating it further too, with an interracial couple like that, you can look at the amazing golden age we have right now of superhero television shows. There have never been this many superhero TV shows that took superheroes seriously, and especially on the CW, you can see how there is a distinct awareness of which ethnicity characters are for the first time. So you see someone like Barry Allen, and the Flash's supporting characters were always white, like many other superheroes, and that particular show they made Iris West, his wife, a black woman. So you do see advancement in that era, not, something that started in comics and traveled elsewhere to television.
No, that's very true. And I this is my personal opinion. Listeners may differ, but I personally do believe that representation matters. And I'm going to give you an example that happened to me a few years ago. So one of my coworkers is a Muslim, and he is the father of 2 daughters. And they were both preteen, I believe, when this happened, like 12 and 9, something like that. So I had mentioned to him about Miss Marvel, who, for the listeners that may not be aware, she's a teenage Muslim. She lives in New Jersey. And I've read probably the first 20, 25 issues of that run. And I'm not the target market, but it's a really good book. It's a fun book. But I mentioned it to him, and I said, hey, I've got the first trade of this. If you'd like to take it and let your daughters read it, you're more than welcome to. I think it's okay for them in terms of content. And he says, yeah, sure. So that was on a Friday. So he comes back on Monday. He said not only did they eat that book up, they begged him to take them to a comic book shop so they could buy more.
That's awesome.
And I was really touched by that. I said, you know what, man, tell them to keep the book. That's a gift from me. I'll get another one. And I ended up buying the hardcover later on. But, that's the kind of resonance that, not only people can identify, everybody reads characters that they can identify with. Mm-hmm. But it's also great for the comic book industry, because if there's a character that keeps you coming back to your LCS, week in and week out, I mean, how is that a bad thing for anybody?
Absolutely, yeah. It's an amazing story, and that's a very good point.
So, but yeah, I hope there's more of this going forward, particularly in light of what we're seeing right now. I hope that one of the major publishers will tackle the George Floyd, not necessarily the George Floyd story itself, but the response to his death. I hope they will tackle that head on, because I think that it is we are living in an important moment in history right now. And I think that, decades from now,
I'd be surprised if comic book writers don't incorporate the moment, we're in with as many protests and how they move people. If they didn't incorporate that somewhat in upcoming stories, I think we'll be seeing that in the near future.
Probably so.
But it is interesting looking back at both superhero companies, DC and Marvel, and they've created so many amazing African-American superheroes in so many eras, too. I mean, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And we are, the industry as a whole always embraced pushing forward with showing an America that represents more than just one race.
No, I agree. And I think there's probably no better medium than comic books to push that envelope forward.
Right.
Because it is a visual medium.
I remember as a kid, back in the 80s, probably mid-80s, Green Lantern had always been Hal Jordan, and Iron Man had always been Tony Stark. And at that time, both titles, the lead characters were black men. It was John Stewart in Green Lantern, and it was Rhodey over on Iron Man. They had new costumes, and it was just seen as natural.
Right.
Before the popular Captain Marvel of today, that is now Carol Danvers in the movies, Captain Marvel back in the 80s was a black woman.
Yeah.
So there's lots of, and you mentioned X-Men. I mean, Storm was actually the leader of the X-Men for a period of time, and one of the most famous leaders they've ever had.
She side note, she's actually one of my favorite X-Men. Her and Rogue are my two favorite X-Men.
Yeah.
But yeah, and to your point about Captain Marvel, the little girl in the movie Captain Marvel, the daughter of her best friend, Carol's best friend, was the same character that went on to become Captain Marvel. So I wonder if that's something we'll see in the MCU in the years ahead.
I hope so. It was great seeing that they incorporated that character into that movie. I think that was one of the highlights of that movie for me, was to see that they hadn't forgotten her and they were incorporating it.
Me too. That was a nice little Easter egg for longtime comic book readers. It probably, I imagine that might have been lost on a lot of people that hadn't read comics, but those of us that have been reading comics for our entire lives, that was a nice little wink and a nod.
Yeah.
So,
and we're also in an era too where we're back in the 70s. It was so rare to see a black superhero as the title character of his own comic. So you look at a title from Marvel, Luke Cage. You look at DC, Black Lightning, and now you look at today. Both those characters have, there's a Black Lightning TV show, which is a phenomenal TV show if you have time to watch it. I think one of the best superhero shows out there. And Luke Cage, another phenomenal TV show and on Netflix. And, both those characters were not forgotten, and they weren't just a period of their time. They're more popular now than they even were then.
Oh, I agree. Totally.
I think one of the more challenging ways to tackle the topic of race relations too was Marvel did put out probably early 2000s. They were taking more chances and being more experimental. And there was a book called Captain America Truth. I know it had a great artwork by Kyle Baker. And the story was the first super soldier before Steve Rogers was a black man, and they tried to pretend he didn't exist. It's a very eye-opening story, trying to show people that, we need to look at history and need to find out things that might be uncomfortable to look at back in history and see what was done, so that we can learn from that and move forward and learn how to do it better.
I agree completely.
It's a really good book if you have a chance to find it. Certainly unlike most anything Marvel ever published too. And another example currently too, of taking on race relations is, DC Comics now has a line of young adult graphic novels, and they've been putting out a successful one called Superman versus the Klan. So it's good seeing the topic advanced, in something coming out on the stands even as we speak. And hopefully we look forward to it in the future too.
I agree. And for what it's worth, that was actually on the books or on the stands weeks before this began, before the protest began.
Right.
So, like I said, the comic book industry does like to push things forward, and that's a great example of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is great looking at some of these examples through history and seeing how comic book industry, was at the forefront of it and trying to advance, black superheroes and black culture in uniting our country. And hopefully that continues, and hopefully we make even more progress in the future.
I hope so. So, on that note, have you got any final thoughts as we wrap this up? Or?
Well, I guess we'll just see what happens from here on out with the DC front, and it's a huge shakeup for retailers, and like you said, fans probably won't notice it, but retailers sure are. It's going to be interesting to see going forward. I know we mentioned it briefly too on our talk about the shape of the after COVID-19 in the comics industry. It'll be interesting to see conventions, and do they go right back to having comic conventions? There's certainly some scheduled in the near future around our area here in Atlanta and elsewhere. And are people going to show up and support them like they used to, or is it going to be social distancing? Are they going to have half their attendance? And if they have to have less attendance, can they still survive? It's a lot to consider as well.
I don't know which convention is scheduled to take place first. but I think that's something that you and I should keep an eye on, and particularly the chatter on it and the fallout from it.
I don't know of anything before. Just off the top of my head, I know mid-July there's SC Comic-Con in Greenville, and there's Tampa Comic-Con. I think that's around the same time there, the middle of July. So that, I don't know of anything before that, but it will be very interesting to see how both those shows work. I mean, you know, I've gone to SC Comic-Con myself over the years, and to get in, there's always a huge line to wait in just, you know, to get a ticket.
Right.
So if social distancing is still enforced at that point, it would be next to impossible to get in line to get a ticket. You know, how does that go forward? I don't know.
We should definitely keep an eye on that, and that will be a great topic for a future episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so I want to thank everybody for listening. If you like what you heard, give us a thumbs up, give us a share. Make sure you subscribe to StarPodLog. I want to thank StarPodLog for having us on their show again.
Yes, thanks for having us back.
Again, my name is Jeff Wiley.
And I'm Tony Barletta.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.